The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped briefing room at Naval Base Coronado, casting harsh shadows across the weathered faces of 6 Navy SEALs. Marcus Rivera sat at the far end of the metal table, his slight frame dwarfed by the hulking warriors surrounding him. At barely 5'7" and weighing only 140 pounds soaking wet, he looked more like a college student who had wandered into the wrong building than someone who belonged among America's elite special operations forces. The other men in the room were legends. Chief Petty Officer Jake "Hammer" Morrison had 17 years in the teams, with 3 bronze stars and a silver star decorating his chest. His arms were thick as tree trunks, scarred from countless missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. To his left sat Tommy "Ghost" Kowalski, a sniper whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. The man could put a bullet through a quarter at 800 meters, and his cold blue eyes had seen things that would break ordinary men. Then there was Sergeant First Class David "Tank" Williams, aptly nicknamed for his ability to barrel through any obstacle in his path. At 6'4" and 230 pounds of pure muscle, he had once carried a wounded teammate 5 miles through enemy territory in Somalia. Next to him, Petty Officer Second Class Luis "Viper" Santos cleaned his fingernails with a combat knife, his movements precise and controlled. The man was a walking arsenal, capable of killing with his bare hands or any weapon he could get his grip on. Rounding out the group were Bulldog Henderson, whose scarred knuckles told stories of countless hand-to-hand encounters, and Ice Peterson, a demolitions expert who could level a building or defuse a bomb with equal skill. Together, they represented over a century of combined combat experience, thousands of successful missions, and more confirmed kills than most small armies. And then there was Marcus Rivera. The 22-year-old had graduated from BUD/S training just 6 months ago, finishing dead last in physical training but somehow managing to ring the bell when bigger, stronger men had quit. He had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, the son of a mechanic and a school teacher. While his new teammates had been preparing for war their entire lives, Marcus had spent his youth buried in books, fascinated by languages and cultures. He spoke fluent Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto, with conversational skills in 4 other languages. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence indicated that a high-value target was hiding in a compound in eastern Afghanistan. The man was responsible for coordinating attacks against American forces and had valuable information about future operations. The team would insert at night, capture the target, and extract before dawn. It was exactly the kind of operation these men had executed hundreds of times before. But as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell spread the aerial photographs across the table, something felt different. The compound was larger than usual, with multiple buildings and what appeared to be a significant civilian population in the surrounding area. The target was known to use human shields, and intelligence suggested he might have his extended family with him. The primary objective is capture, not kill, Mitchell emphasized, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. This man has intelligence that could save American lives. But we need him breathing to get it. Hammer leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. His dark eyes scanned the photographs with the practiced gaze of a man who had studied hundreds of similar images over the years. "Looks like a standard snatch and grab to me," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and aggressive tactics. "Agreed," Tank rumbled, his massive frame shifting as he pointed to what appeared to be the main building. "We go in. Hard and fast. Secure the target. And get out. Before anyone knows we were there." Ghost nodded his approval, already calculating angles and sightlines from the surrounding terrain. "I can set up overwatch here," he said, tapping a ridge about 400 meters from the compound. "Clean shots into the courtyard and main building." The other SEALs murmured their agreement, falling into the familiar rhythm of mission planning. They had done this dance so many times, it was almost automatic. Identify the target, plan the approach, execute with overwhelming force, and extract. It was a formula that had worked for them in dozens of previous operations. Marcus listened quietly, his dark eyes studying the photographs with a different kind of intensity. While his teammates saw a tactical problem to be solved with speed and violence, he saw something else entirely. The compound wasn't just a military target, it was someone's home. The aerial images showed children's toys scattered in the courtyard, laundry hanging on lines, and what appeared to be a small garden where someone was trying to grow vegetables in the harsh Afghan soil. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, raising his hand slightly. The conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to the youngest member of the team. He could feel their attention like a physical weight, and for a moment, his courage almost failed him. These men had forgotten more about warfare than he had ever learned, and he was about to challenge their assessment based on 6 months of training and a few books he had read. But something deep inside him refused to stay silent. "I think we might want to consider a different approach," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Based on the cultural intelligence we have about this region, going in with a standard raid might actually work against us." The silence that followed was deafening. Hammer's eyes narrowed, and Marcus could see the barely contained irritation flickering across the older man's face. Tank actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief that echoed off the concrete walls. "Kid," Hammer said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "I was running ops when you were still playing with action figures. We've captured dozens of high-value targets using these exact tactics. Fast, quiet, efficient. We get in, we get our man, we get out." "With respect, Chief," Marcus replied, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "Those other operations were in different areas, with different tribal structures. This particular compound is located in a region controlled by the Ahmadzai tribe. And our target isn't just a terrorist leader. According to the cultural intelligence briefings, he's also considered a respected elder in the community." Viper looked up from his knife, his expression skeptical. "So what are you saying, college boy? We should just walk up and knock on the door?" The nickname stung, but Marcus pressed on. "I'm saying that if we go in shooting, we're not just attacking a terrorist. We're attacking someone these people see as their grandfather, their protector. Even if we successfully capture him, we'll turn the entire village against us. And if we kill any civilians in the process, we'll create a dozen new terrorists for every one we capture." The room erupted in a chorus of dismissive comments. Ice shook his head in disgust. "This is exactly what's wrong with the new guys they're sending us. Too much time in classrooms, not enough time in the real world." Bulldog cracked his knuckles, a sound like small explosions in the confined space. "The real world doesn't care about your cultural sensitivity, kid. It cares about completing the mission and bringing everyone home alive." Marcus felt his face flush, but he refused to back down. Every instinct told him to apologize, to defer to the experience and expertise of the men around him. They were war heroes, legends in their field. Who was he to question their judgment? But another voice in his head, quieter but more insistent, reminded him of why he had joined the SEALs in the first place. It wasn't for the glory or the reputation. It was because he believed that America's military should be a force for good in the world, protecting the innocent and defeating those who would do them harm. And sometimes, protecting the innocent meant challenging the conventional wisdom, even when it was uncomfortable. "I understand your concerns," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I'm not questioning your experience or your abilities, but I think there might be a way to complete this mission that doesn't require us to fight our way through an entire village." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, leaned forward. "What do you have in mind, Rivera?" "What?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either prove his worth to the team or cement his reputation as an inexperienced idealist who didn't belong among warriors. "I think we should consider a deception operation," he said, spreading his hands over the photographs. "Instead of going in as invaders, we go in as allies." The room fell silent again. But this time the quality of the silence was different. Instead of dismissive anger, Marcus could sense a grudging curiosity from some of the men around the table. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell gestured for him to continue. The target's compound is isolated, but it's not completely cut off from the outside world, Marcus explained, pointing to a road that snaked through the mountains on the aerial photograph. Supply convoys pass through this area regularly, and according to our intelligence, the village has been complaining about increased Taliban activity affecting their trade routes. Ghost leaned forward, his sniper's eyes studying the terrain with renewed interest. You're thinking about posing as a relief convoy? Not exactly, Marcus replied, feeling more confident as he saw that at least one of the veterans was taking him seriously. I'm thinking we pose as an Afghan National Army patrol that's been sent to investigate reports of Taliban activity in the area. The target has been hiding his identity from the locals, presenting himself as a simple village elder. If we show up asking questions about Taliban fighters in the region, he'll have to choose between maintaining his cover and risking exposure, or revealing himself as someone with detailed knowledge about terrorist activities. Tank shook his head, his massive arms crossed over his chest. That's assuming he doesn't just lie to us. What's to stop him from playing dumb and sending us on our way? Marcus had anticipated this objection. Because we won't be alone. I speak fluent Pashto, and I've studied the local dialect. I can present myself as an Afghan intelligence officer working with the ANA patrol. In that culture, lying to intelligence officials is extremely dangerous, even for someone with the target's connections. He'll know that if he's caught lying, it could bring serious scrutiny to the entire village. Viper snorted in derision. And you think your 6 months of language training is going to fool someone who's lived in that culture his entire life? No, Marcus admitted. But I think my understanding of that culture might give us an advantage that a frontal assault won't. This man has survived as long as he has because he's smart and careful. He knows that American Special Forces conduct raids in his area. He's prepared for that. He's got escape routes planned, early warning systems in place, probably weapons cached throughout the compound. But he's not prepared for a conversation. Hammer had been listening with growing skepticism, his scarred hands drumming against the metal table. Kid, you're talking about walking into a hostile compound with minimal backup and no clear extraction plan. What happens when your little chat goes sideways and they start shooting? What happens when your perfect Pashto doesn't sound quite as authentic as you think it does? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Marcus could feel the weight of it, the very real possibility that his plan could get people killed. These men weren't just skeptical because they didn't like him. They were skeptical because they had seen what happened when operations went wrong. They had carried wounded teammates out of ambushes, attended funerals for friends who had died because someone had made a mistake. You're right, Marcus said quietly. It's a risk. But so is a direct assault on a fortified compound in the middle of a populated area. The difference is that my plan gives us the option to walk away if things go wrong. If I can't maintain my cover, if the target gets suspicious, we abort and fall back to the original plan. But if it works, we complete the mission without firing a shot, without creating new enemies, and without putting civilian lives at risk. Ice, who had been silent through most of the discussion, suddenly spoke up. What about the rest of us? In your plan, what's our role? Marcus turned to face the demolitions expert, grateful for what sounded like a genuine tactical question rather than another dismissal. You'd be positioned around the perimeter, close enough to provide support if needed, but far enough away to avoid detection. If the conversation approach works, you extract with the target and me. If it doesn't work, you're already in position for a traditional assault. The discussion that followed was intense and detailed. Mitchell asked probing questions about timing, communications, and contingency plans. The SEALs challenged every aspect of Marcus's proposal, looking for weaknesses and potential failure points. But gradually, something shifted in the room. The outright hostility gave way to professional debate. Ghost was the first to come around. I hate to admit it, he said, but The kid might have a point. We've been hitting compounds in this area for 6 months, and the locals are getting better at spotting our approach. Last month, Tank and I spent 4 hours in a firefight because someone tipped off our target before we reached the objective. Tank nodded reluctantly. Place was like a fortress by the time we got there. Lost the element of surprise completely. And we still don't know how many civilians got caught in the crossfire, Bulldog added, his voice carrying a note of regret that surprised Marcus. The scarred veteran rarely showed emotion, but the thought of innocent casualties clearly bothered him. Viper was harder to convince. Even if the approach works, even if the target believes our cover story, how do we actually capture him? We can't exactly arrest him in front of his entire family and expect to walk out uncontested. Marcus had thought about this problem extensively during the briefing. We don't arrest him there. We request that he accompany us back to the district center for further questioning. In Afghan culture, refusing such a request would be seen as suspicious and disrespectful to government authority. He'll come with us to maintain his cover, and once we're away from the compound, we take him. And if he refuses? Hammer pressed. Then we know we've blown our cover, and we execute the extraction immediately. But even if that happens, we're still in a better position than if we had started with a raid. We're inside his defenses. We know the layout of the compound, and we have detailed intelligence about the number and positioning of potential hostiles. The debate continued for another hour, with each team member raising objections and concerns. But gradually, Marcus began to notice something he hadn't expected. The questions were becoming more constructive, less focused on tearing down his plan, and more focused on refining it. When Hammer suggested modifications to the communication protocol, Marcus listened carefully and incorporated the feedback. When Ghost recommended changes to the positioning of the Overwatch elements, Marcus nodded and made notes. For the first time since joining the team, he felt like he was being treated as a colleague rather than a liability. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell finally called a halt to the discussion. "I want you all to think about this overnight," she said, gathering the photographs and intelligence reports. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning, with a final decision on the approach." As the meeting broke up, the SEALs filed out of the room in small groups, their conversation muted and serious. Marcus gathered his notes slowly, acutely aware that several of the men were casting glances in his direction. He couldn't tell if they were looks of newfound respect or barely contained irritation. Hammer was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the young SEAL who had just challenged everything he thought he knew about conducting operations in Afghanistan. "Rivera," the chief said, his voice carrying none of its earlier hostility. "Walk with me." They stepped out into the California sunshine, the warmth a sharp contrast to the air-conditioned briefing room. Hammer pulled out a worn pack of cigarettes and lit one, taking a long drag before speaking. 20 years ago, I would have torn you apart for what you did in there," he said, exhaling smoke toward the cloudless sky. "Would have made your life hell until you either shaped up or shipped out." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, preparing for the verbal assault he had been expecting since the moment he first opened his mouth in the briefing room. "But 20 years ago, we were fighting a different kind of war," Hammer continued. "Back then, our enemies wore uniforms and held territory. You could identify them, engage them, and defeat them using conventional tactics. This war is different. These enemies hide among civilians. They use our own rules against us, and every mistake we make creates more of them." He took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes distant with memories of battles fought in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. "I've seen a lot of smart guys come and go over the years," Hammer said finally. "Most of them think their book learning makes them experts on warfare. Most of them are wrong, but every now and then, someone comes along who sees something the rest of us miss." He dropped the cigarette and ground it under his boot, then turned to face Marcus directly. "I'm not saying your plan is perfect. I'm not even saying it's going to work, but I am saying that you've got the guts to stand up in a room full of veterans and challenge our assumptions. That takes courage, kid. Different kind of courage than what we're used to, but courage all the same." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. The approval of men like Hammer meant more to him than any medal or commendation ever could. Just remember, Hammer added with a slight smile, if your plan gets us all killed, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. 48 hours later, Marcus found himself crouched behind a rocky outcropping 3 kilometers from the target compound, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The Afghan National Army uniform felt strange against his skin. The unfamiliar weight of the equipment distributed differently than his usual loadout. But it was the radio earpiece that felt most foreign, connecting him to 5 of the most lethal warriors in the American military, who were now depending on his ability to talk his way through what could become a deadly confrontation. "Ghost in position," came the whispered voice in his ear. The sniper had established his hide site on the ridge overlooking the compound. His scope trained on the main building where intelligence suggested their target was currently located. "Tank and Bulldog, eastern perimeter secure," followed another voice. The 2 assault specialists had moved into position before dawn, ready to provide covering fire if the mission went sideways. "Viper and Ice, western approach clear," came the final check-in. The team was spread in a loose circle around the compound, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough away to avoid detection by the village's early warning systems. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio from the command post. "Hammer, you're cleared for approach. Remember, this is your show, Rivera." Marcus took a deep breath, checking his equipment one final time. The ANA uniform was authentic, borrowed from friendly forces at a nearby forward operating base. His weapon was a standard-issue Kalashnikov, chosen to maintain the deception. Most importantly, his documentation identified him as Captain Nasir Ahmad of the Afghan National Directorate of Security, complete with official stamps and signatures that had been prepared by intelligence specialists. Moving toward target, he whispered into his radio, then switched to Pashto as he stepped out from behind the rocks with Hammer following close behind. The compound was exactly as the aerial photographs had depicted, but seeing it with his own eyes gave Marcus a different perspective on the challenge ahead. The walls were higher than they had appeared from above, constructed from local stone that had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. Children's voices carried across the courtyard, and the smell of cooking fires drifted on the morning air. This wasn't a military installation or terrorist hideout. It was a home. An elderly man emerged from the main building as they approached the gate, his weathered face curious but not particularly alarmed. In this part of Afghanistan, visits from government officials were rare, but not unknown. Marcus had counted on that familiarity to ease their initial approach. "Peace be upon you, uncle," Marcus called out in Pashto, using the traditional greeting. His pronunciation was careful, shaped by months of practice with native speakers at the Defense Language Institute. "And upon you, peace," the man replied, his eyes taking in their uniforms and equipment with the practiced gaze of someone who had lived through decades of conflict. "How may we help you?" "Officers, I am Captain Ahmad from the National Directorate of Security," Marcus replied, presenting his credentials with just the right mixture of authority and respect. "This is Sergeant Karim from the Army. We are investigating reports of Taliban activity in this region." The old man's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "We have seen no Taliban fighters here, Captain." "This is a peaceful village," Marcus nodded, as if he had expected this response. "I understand, Uncle, but we have received information that suggests otherwise. May we speak with the village elders about this matter? It is important that we gather accurate information to protect your community." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Marcus carefully building rapport while gradually increasing the pressure. He asked detailed questions about recent, unusual activities, strangers passing through the area, and any suspicious behavior by members of the community. Throughout the exchange, he watched the old man's body language and facial expressions, looking for signs that might indicate deception or nervousness. Finally, the man gestured toward the main building. "Our most respected elder is inside. Perhaps he can answer your questions better than I can." 1. As they walked across the courtyard, Marcus noticed several women watching from doorways and windows, their faces partially concealed, but their eyes alert and intelligent. Children played with handmade toys in the shade of a large tree, their laughter creating a soundtrack that seemed to mock the deadly serious nature of his mission. The interior of the building was cool and dimly lit, furnished with traditional carpets and cushions. And there, seated against the far wall in a position that commanded a clear view of both the entrance and a rear exit, was their target. Abdul Rahman al-Zawahiri looked exactly as he did in his intelligence photographs. But seeing him in person created a cognitive disconnect for Marcus. This man was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed and wounded dozens of American soldiers. He had planned bombings that had targeted schools and markets, caring nothing for the innocent lives destroyed by his actions. But sitting in his traditional robes, surrounded by family photographs and religious texts, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be: a village elder, trying to protect his community. "Peace be upon you, grandfather," Marcus said, using the respectful term for an elderly man of high status. "And upon you, peace, my son," al-Zawahiri replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Please, sit. You have traveled far to reach our village." As they settled onto the cushions, Marcus began his careful interrogation. He started with general questions about the village's security situation, gradually working his way toward more specific inquiries about Taliban activities. Al-Zawahiri answered thoughtfully, projecting the image of a concerned elder trying to be helpful while clearly measuring each word. But Marcus had spent months studying the intelligence reports on this man, and he began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the responses. Al-Zawahiri claimed to know nothing about recent Taliban movements, yet he demonstrated a suspiciously detailed knowledge of coalition patrol schedules. He insisted that no strangers had visited the village recently, but mentioned specific concerns about increased military activity that suggested access to information not available to ordinary civilians. The crucial moment came when Marcus asked about a particular road junction about 5 kilometers from the village. Intelligence indicated that al-Zawahiri had used this location to coordinate several recent attacks, but the information was highly classified, known only to a small number of people within the terrorist network. "Have you noticed any unusual activity near the crossroads where the old Soviet road meets the new highway?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice casual. For just a moment, al-Zawahiri's eyes sharpened with recognition before he caught himself. "I am not familiar with that location, Captain. My old legs do not carry me as far as they once did." But Marcus had seen the reaction, and he knew that al-Zawahiri knew that he had seen it. The pretense was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain for both sides. "Of course, grandfather," Marcus replied smoothly. "Perhaps you could recommend someone else who might have information about that area. Someone who travels more frequently." The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Al-Zawahiri's family members had gradually moved closer to the conversation, and Marcus could sense their growing unease. Through his earpiece, he could hear the barely audible voices of his teammates repositioning around the compound. "I fear I cannot help you with such specific questions," al-Zawahiri said finally. "Perhaps you should speak with the district governor's office. They would have better information about road conditions and security concerns." It was a polite dismissal, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Actually, grandfather, I was hoping you might accompany us to the district center. As the most respected elder in this region, your insights would be valuable for our ongoing investigation." The room fell completely silent. This was the moment that would determine whether Marcus's plan succeeded or whether they would have to fight their way out of the compound. In Afghan culture, such a request from government officials carried significant weight, but al-Zawahiri was no ordinary village elder. He was a wanted terrorist with every reason to avoid official questioning. Al-Zawahiri sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes studying Marcus with newfound intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality, colder and more calculating than before. "I am afraid that will not be possible, Captain. I am needed here to oversee the harvest preparations." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The refusal was polite but firm, and it confirmed his suspicions about their target's true identity. An ordinary village elder would have found it very difficult to decline such a request without appearing disrespectful or suspicious. I understand your concerns about the harvest, Marcus replied, maintaining his calm tone while his mind raced through contingency plans. However, this is a matter of national security. I must insist that you accompany us for questioning. The pretense finally crumbled completely. Al-Zawahiri's expression hardened, and Marcus could see the terrorist leader calculating his options. The man's right hand moved almost imperceptibly toward a concealed weapon, and Marcus knew they had reached the point of no return. I am afraid, young man, that you have made a serious mistake, Al-Zawahiri said, his voice now carrying unmistakable menace. Ghost. I need immediate overwatch, Marcus whispered in English into his radio, simultaneously drawing his sidearm as Al-Zawahiri reached for his concealed weapon. What followed happened in seconds but felt like hours. Al-Zawahiri's hand closed on the grip of a pistol hidden beneath his robes, but Marcus was already moving. The weeks of training at the SEAL compound had prepared him for exactly this moment, and muscle memory took over where conscious thought faltered. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space, but it wasn't Marcus who fired. Hammer, who had been positioned near the rear exit, put 2 rounds center mass into Al-Zawahiri before the terrorist could bring his weapon to bear. Target down, Hammer's voice crackled through the radio. Compound secured. The aftermath was swift and professional. The other team members moved through the building, securing potential intelligence materials while ensuring that no civilians were harmed. Al-Zawahiri's family was detained but not mistreated, and a thorough search revealed a cache of weapons and communication equipment that confirmed his identity and activities. As they prepared for extraction, Marcus found himself standing in the courtyard where children had been playing just an hour earlier. The toys were still scattered in the dust, but the laughter had been replaced by the tense silence that follows violence. Hammer approached him, checking his equipment and preparing for the helicopter that would take them back to base. How do you feel, kid? Marcus considered the question carefully. His plan had worked, in the sense that they had successfully identified and captured their target. But it had also failed, in the sense that they had ultimately been forced to use violence in a place where children lived and played. I don't know, he admitted finally. We got the job done, but it didn't end the way I hoped it would. Hammer nodded, understanding evident in his weathered face. That's the thing about this job, Rivera. It almost never ends the way we hope it will, but sometimes it ends the way it needs to. As the helicopter lifted off from the landing zone, carrying them away from the compound and back to the safety of their base, Marcus looked down at the village, growing smaller below them. He had proven himself to his teammates in the most definitive way possible, earning their respect through a combination of courage, intelligence, and tactical innovation. But more importantly, he had learned something about himself. He had discovered that sometimes holding your ground meant more than just standing firm in the face of opposition. Sometimes it meant being willing to challenge conventional wisdom, even when everyone around you had more experience and expertise. Sometimes it meant trusting your instincts and your training, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The 6 SEALs who had questioned his judgment in that briefing room now understood who Marcus Rivera really was. He wasn't just the youngest member of their team, or the one with the least combat experience. He was the one who could see solutions where others saw only problems, who could find new approaches to old challenges, and who had the courage to stand up for his convictions, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. In the months that followed, Marcus would go on to plan and execute dozens of successful operations, earning commendations and building a reputation as one of the military's most innovative tactical thinkers. But he would never forget the lesson he learned in that briefing room at Naval Base Coronado. That sometimes, the most important battle you can fight is the one for your own voice, your own perspective, and your own right to be heard.